It wasn't supposed to end like that. Margaret stood on the faded porch of her son's suburban home in Oregon. The weight of her casserole dish cooling in her hands, the winter air nipping at her knuckles. Behind the closed door, she could still hear the muffled sounds of cartoons, a toddler's giggle, and the faint hum of the dishwasher. Domestic peace. A life she once belonged to. The door hadn't just shut. It had slammed. And before that, those words, ones she had never expected to hear from her own child, had split the morning in two. "We don't want your help, Mom. You make things harder." It echoed in her chest like a dull, repeating bell. Margaret stared at the door, waiting for it to open again. For someone, maybe little Henry with his soft curls, maybe even Angela with her clipped but civil tone, to swing it open and say, "Sorry, he didn't mean that. Come in." But it stayed shut. She stood still for several minutes before, setting the casserole down gently on the welcome mat. A pathetic offering. Then she walked back to her car. The silence inside it wrapped around her like a second skin. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the ignition. Margaret had raised Thomas alone after his father left when he was 7. She hadn't always gotten it right. Money was tight. Tempers ran short. And birthdays were sometimes just boxed cake and a toy from the clearance aisle. But she had tried. Every scraped knee, every school recital, every shift she picked up at the hospital when she should have been sleeping, it had all been for him now. At 71, her days were a muted loop of grocery trips, crossword puzzles, and watching birds from her apartment window. The only real brightness came from her grandson, Henry. Every Sunday, she drove across town with Tupperware containers and stories. Henry would squeal and climb into her lap, and for a moment, life made sense again, until this morning. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, a mug of decaf untouched beside her. The casserole dish sat on the counter, unopened, cold. She didn't cry. Not immediately. The tears came later, quiet and stuttering, surprising even herself. She wasn't angry exactly, just displaced. Like someone had rearranged the furniture. In a room she once knew by heart. On her fridge, a postcard from Spain sent by her neighbor's daughter caught her eye. A photo of a plaza somewhere, full of color and laughter and music. She had pinned it there months ago because it reminded her of something she couldn't name. Margaret got up, walked over, and took the card down, turned it over in her hand. Something inside her, a faint, stubborn ember, began to stir. She sat back down and opened her laptop. The screen glowed gently in the dark room. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before typing. Language classes for beginners near me. The next morning she showed up at the community center, 10 minutes early. The hallway smelled of cleaning supplies and something sweet, maybe cinnamon rolls. A handwritten sign read French Room 204. Her heart beat fast, unsure if it was excitement or the residue of yesterday. In the classroom, 6 other adults sat scattered around tables. Some were older than her. One man wore a beret. Woman in the back was already flipping through a workbook. When the teacher, a young woman with a warm smile and a gentle French accent, greeted the class, Margaret sat up straighter. Bonne way. Today we begin not just with language, but with a little courage. Margaret blinked. Courage. The word sat in her chest like a seed. She fumbled through the first few greetings, her tongue clumsy over bonjour and comment que va. When she got a simple TR's bean, mercy out, the teacher beamed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, she called Thomas. No answer. She didn't leave a voicemail. There was nothing more to say right now. Instead, she made herself tea, sat at the kitchen table with her new workbook, and repeated French phrases under her breath. Somewhere around lesson 3, she paused. She didn't know what she was working toward yet. Just that it was no longer here. She was no longer waiting for the door to open again. Maybe, she thought, it was time to find a new door, one she could walk through wide open, entirely on her own. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late spring when Margaret stood at Gate 37B at Portland International Airport. passport in hand, a modest suitcase beside her. Her fingers curled around the boarding pass like it might vanish if she let go. The screen. Overhead read. Paris, Charles de Gaulle. She'd rehearsed this moment for weeks, booked the ticket herself, applied for the long-stay visa, a bureaucratic maze that took hours and 3 trips to the consulate in San Francisco. She'd sublet her apartment to a retired couple who were snowbirding in the Pacific Northwest. Canceled her magazine subscriptions, forwarded her mail. She hadn't told Thomas, not out of spite, but because telling him meant asking for something. Recognition? Maybe. Permission. And she didn't need that anymore. She glanced at the boarding line. People laughed, wrestled with carry-ons, held coffee cups and travel pillows like talismans. She felt like a ghost in her own body. But she moved forward. The flight was long. Her seatmate, a woman named Elise from Vancouver, chatted cheerfully for the first hour before dozing off to a true crime podcast. Margaret watched the screen in front of her flicker with flight progress. It's a tiny plane crawling across the Atlantic. Somewhere over Greenland, she started to cry. It wasn't loud, just a quiet stream of tears that surprised her. She wiped them, away with a tiny napkin from her apple juice. Thankful Elise was still snoring softly in her earbuds. The truth was, she wasn't entirely sure why she was doing this. There was no grand plan, no job, no relatives in France. It's just a rental studio in a small town called Collier, near the Spanish border, a place she chose because the photos looked peaceful. The rent was affordable, and the idea of the sea nearby made her feel like she could breathe. Arrival was a blur of fatigue, customs, and miscommunication. A young customs officer asked her something in rapid French. She panicked, then managed to stammer "Je suis désolé. Je parle un peu français," smiled, nodded, and waved her through. By the time she arrived at her flat, a quaint, second-story walk-up with blue shutters and a view of terracotta rooftops, her legs trembled from exhaustion. She didn't unpack. She peeled off her shoes, laid down on the narrow bed, and slept for 13 hours. The next morning, Collier greeted her with golden sun and the scent of salt and lavender. The narrow streets were cobbled and winding, lined with pastel houses and little cafes that spilled out onto the pavement. Locals greeted each other with kisses on both cheeks. A dog barked lazily from a balcony. The rhythm was slower here, not sluggish, but deliberate, like life was. Something to be savored, not conquered. Margaret walked the streets with cautious wonder. At a boulangerie, she pointed awkwardly at a croissant. "Un s'il vous plaît?" The woman behind the counter responded kindly, correcting her pronunciation without scolding. She left with warm pastry in hand, a small thrill fluttering in. Her chestot she found the town's language school tucked between a wine shop and a florist. A wooden sign above the door read "École de langue et culture." A class for adults started the following week. She signed up without hesitation. That evening, she sat on a stone bench near the harbor, watching the fishing boats drift lazily. In the sunset, couple beside her argued in French, laughing even as they disagreed. A child skipped rocks nearby. Margaret felt something shift inside her. Not joy exactly. Not yet, but a softness, a loosening, like she had been holding her breath for a very long time and was now remembering how to exhale. Her studio was simple but full of charm. The windows opened wide, letting in sea breeze and bird song. The tiny kitchenette barely held a stove, but she managed scrambled eggs and coffee just fine. She bought a second-hand radio at the market, tuning it to a station that played old French chansons. The voices were foreign and familiar at once, like lullabies from a dream. She hadn't known she'd had. She started to make small routines. Morning walks to the boulangerie, an hour of workbook exercises, afternoons on the cafe terrace with her dictionary and a notebook. She scribbled down overheard phrases and tried to decode them later. She began to recognize faces. The florist, with the red scarf, the old man who played chess alone by the fountain, the teenage girl who roller skated through the square every afternoon. She didn't speak much, Not yet. But she was watching, learning, becoming. One day, a woman around her age approached her at the market. She had short gray hair and glasses that slid down her nose. Vous êtes nouvelle ici? Non. She asked. Margaret blinked, then replied haltingly. Oui, je suis nouvelle américaine. The woman smiled warmly. Je suis Claire. Benvenue. They stood there among the tomatoes and olives, two strangers fumbling toward friendship. Claire spoke slowly, kindly. They exchanged phone numbers. Felt like a small miracle. Later, Margaret wrote a letter she never sent. Dear Thomas, I've arrived. It's beautiful here. I miss Henry. I miss you too, in a way that surprises me. But I'm learning to live without waiting for a door to open. For now, that's enough. Love, Mom. She folded the letter, placed it in her journal, went to sleep with the windows open. It's the sound of the waves murmuring something like a promise. Tomorrow, she would meet Claire for coffee. And maybe, just maybe, she would speak without stammering. Margaret was beginning to recognize the mornings by their particular shades of light. In Oregon, dawns had been gray and hesitant, often smudged with fog or drizzle. But here in Collier, the sun arrived like it had nothing to prove, golden, steady, brushing the walls of her studio with quiet confidence. It warmed her skin as she stood by the window, cradling her chipped blue mug. She was beginning to sleep better. Not through the whole night, that would take time. But now the insomnia was gentler, less of a battle, more of a conversation. On good nights, she'd wake briefly around 3 a.m., then drift off again to the hum of distant waves and the comfort of her own breath. Claire had become her first true connection. They met twice a week now, sometimes for coffee, other times just to walk along the promenade. Claire spoke a mix of French and English, often correcting Margaret softly without judgment. She had lived in Collier for almost a decade, having moved from Lyon after her husband died. You know, Claire said once, as they watched seagulls dart across the sky, it took me 2 years to stop feeling like a visitor. But when I did, it was like someone handed me the key to my own house. Margaret smiled, tucking that thought away. Language class was both humbling and exhilarating. Each lesson was a roller coaster, the small triumph of understanding a verb tense, followed by the frustration of butchering a sentence in conversation. But the teacher, Marianne, was patient and spirited. She used games, role-play, even cooking vocabulary days to keep things lively. Margaret began keeping a victory journal, a habit Claire had suggested where she jotted down small wins, successfully ordered lunch without switching to English, understood a joke at the bakery, learned that shoe means cabbage, but also sweetheart. It became her favorite ritual, not because the victories were impressive, but because they were hers. Still, there were hard days. Some mornings, the silence of her flat pressed against her like a weight. She would reach instinctively for her phone to call Thomas, only to freeze mid-motion. Henry had sent her one photo since she left, a drawing of a boat with the words, "For Grandma," scrawled underneath. Angela included a short note. He misses you. That was it. She had stared at the image for hours, trying to decide if it meant reconciliation or just politeness. One Saturday, Claire invited her to a gathering, a casual dinner with a few neighbors. Margaret hesitated, nerves knotting in her stomach. You don't have to say much, Claire said. Just come. You'll see people are kind here. That evening, dressed in her least wrinkled blouse, Margaret walked the narrow streets to Claire's apartment. The building was old, with tiled floors and high ceilings, filled with the smell of roasted vegetables and red wine. There were 7 people in total: retired schoolteacher, a painter and his partner, a young couple from Marseille, and an Algerian woman named Samira who spoke 5 languages and laughed with her whole chest. They welcomed Margaret like she was already expected, not with the awkward politeness she feared, but with warmth, like an extra chair had always been waiting for her. She didn't speak much, but she listened, laughed, and nodded. Someone poured her a second glass of wine. The painter told her she had une voix douce, a soft voice. It felt like a compliment and a kindness all at once. Later, when she returned to her flat, cheeks flushed and heart-light. She opened her journal and wrote just 3 words. I belonged tonight. The following week during class, Marianne asked everyone to prepare a short monologue about why they had chosen to learn French. Students kept it light: travel, retirement, curiosity. When it was Margaret's turn, she stood slowly, holding her notes. Her voice wavered, but she spoke. I come from Oregon. I lived a quiet life. I had a family, but I left. It's because I needed to remember who I am. I learned French because I want to live, not just wait. There was a long pause. No one clapped. They didn't need to. Marianne just nodded, eyes a little misty, and said softly, Tears bean, Margaret. And that somehow meant everything. That night, she wrote another unsent letter. Dear Thomas, I met people tonight who saw me, not as someone who once mattered, but as someone who still could. I'm learning how to be someone new without erasing who I was. I hope someday you'll want to meet her. Love, Mom. She folded it, slid it into her journal beside the drawing of the boat outside. The bells of the old church rang the hour. She opened the window, let the cool sea breeze in, and whispered to no one in particular, I'm still here. And this time it didn't feel like a question. Margaret didn't recognize the handwriting on the envelope at first. It was resting in her mailbox, beneath a stack of junk flyers, one of those long rectangular envelopes, the kind that usually carried bad news or bills. She brought it up to her flat, tossing the stack on the kitchen table as she peeled off her coat. Only when she picked it up again, after her second cup of tea, did she notice the return address. Angela Keene, Portland, Oregon. She held the letter like it might burn. Angela had never written to her before. Not once. Not even when Margaret sent birthday cards or small gifts for Henry. Their relationship had always been one of obligation, strained by unspoken judgments and guarded politeness. She stared at the envelope for a long time. Then she opened it. Dear Margaret, I wasn't sure if I should write. But Thomas doesn't know I am, and maybe that's why I finally did. There's a lot I haven't said, and maybe too much time has passed. But I've been thinking about you, especially since Henry started asking why you don't visit anymore. I've told him that you're on an adventure, learning French, living by the sea. He draws you with a beret. Now I hope that makes you smile. It did me. I won't pretend. Things were simple. You and I never really saw eye to eye. But I think deep down we both wanted the same thing, to feel needed, to matter. Thomas has been ... overwhelmed. Not that it excuses how he spoke to you. I don't think he realizes how final words can sound, especially when said in anger. Just wanted you to know that we're okay. Kay and I hope you are too. Henry misses you. I think I do too, in a way I didn't expect. Angela Margaret read it twice, and a third time, slower. She didn't cry. She didn't know what she felt. Exactly, only that something inside her began to stir. Not grief, not hope. Something quieter, more cautious. She folded the letter neatly, tucked it into the back of her journal, and went outside. The sky was soft with clouds that afternoon, the Mediterranean gray, blue, and calm. She walked aimlessly through Collier, past the cafes, where tourists clinked glasses, past the old church that now rang comfort instead of loneliness. She thought of Angela not as the woman who married her son, but as someone whose life had also been cracked open by motherhood, by the awkward dance of blending expectations and identity. Maybe they'd both tried to claim the same ground without realizing it. The thought didn't erase the past, but it softened it. That week, Claire invited Margaret to a watercolor class at the harbor. You don't need to be good, she said. You just need to show up. The group sat on low stools with sketch pads in their laps, painting the boats, bobbing in the sun. Margaret hadn't painted since high school. Her hands felt clumsy, unsure of color and line, but there was something meditative in it, watching the blues spread across the page, the bristles dancing without precision. A woman named Anne, originally from Belgium, sat beside her. She was loud and funny and cursed like a sailor when she spilled ochre on her skirt. "You're American?" she asked. "Yes," Margaret replied. "Oregon. Why France?" Margaret smiled faintly. "'Cause I had nowhere else to go. And then I realized that might be exactly what I needed." Anne nodded like she understood. Venway O Club. In class, Margaret had moved to the intermediate group. It was still hard, verbs tangled in her throat. Genders confused her, but she noticed something strange happening. When she spoke, people waited. They listened. They didn't rush her. She wasn't invisible here. Was becoming. One evening after class, she passed a small cafe where a local band played jazz on Fridays. Something about the music, the way it didn't need words to be understood, pulled her in. She sat at a corner table with a glass of wine, letting the trumpet carry her someplace between memory and discovery. A man in his 60s sat 2 tables over, reading a paperback and tapping his foot in time with the music. He glanced at her, briefly nodded once. She nodded back. It wasn't flirtation. It's just recognition. She stayed for an hour. On her walk home, she realized she had forgotten to think about Thomas. That her mind had been filled instead with music, color, rhythm. She hadn't expected that to feel like progress. That night she wrote a letter, but this time she didn't hesitate to send it. "Dear Henry, thank you for the drawing. I loved the boat and the little French flag you added. I keep it on my desk next to a seashell I found on the beach here. I think you'd like it. The water is bright blue and the sky is very big. Sometimes I pretend you're here, building sandcastles. I'm learning so much about language and art and how to eat cheese without crackers. Can you believe that? I miss you. And I hope you're learning things too. I'll write again soon. Love you always." Grandma She sealed the envelope, added careful international postage, and placed it by the door to mail in the morning. She didn't expect a reply, but somehow she knew she would be okay even if it never came. It started with a dull ache in her side. Margaret had ignored it for a few days, assuming it was a pulled muscle. The result of reaching too far for the baguettes at the back of the shelf or twisting wrong while watering the geraniums. She took an ibuprofen, drank extra water, carried on, but by the 4th day, the ache had grown sharper. And that morning, while walking back from the market, her vision swam slightly. She had to stop near the fountain, one hand gripping the stone, edge while she caught her breath. The warmth of Collier suddenly felt suffocating, not comforting. She made it home slowly, sat on the edge of her bed, pressed her palm to her ribcage. The pain had settled there now, insistent, low, and steady. Like a knock she could no longer pretend not to hear. She didn't panic. Not exactly. But she was afraid. It was the first time since arriving that she felt truly alone. In Oregon, she would have called Thomas. Even if they weren't close anymore, she would have known that someone could drive her, speak to doctors, wait in the lobby. But now, she had no emergency. Contact listed in France. No one to call who shared her last name. Her breath hitched slightly as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. After a long moment, she messaged Claire. "Hi, I'm feeling a bit unwell. Nothing serious, I think. But could you maybe help me get to the doctor?" The reply came back in less than a minute. "Of course. I'll be there in 10. At the small clinic just outside the town center." A kindly nurse named Fabienne took her vitals and asked questions Margaret struggled to answer in French. Claire translated where needed, gently guiding her through the process like a seasoned navigator. The doctor, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, suspected a kidney stone. Nothing urgent, but enough to require rest, hydration, and pain management. "Rien de grave," he said kindly. "Mais il-faut ralentir. Unpel." "Nothing serious," Claire translated. "But you need to slow down a little." Margaret smiled weakly. "I thought moving to France was me slowing down." Back in her flat, Claire helped her into bed and made a pot of herbal tea. "Should have told me sooner," Claire scolded gently. "You don't need to be so brave." Margaret looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly. "I think I was afraid that if something happened, no one would even know." Claire placed a hand over hers. "Well, now someone does." The simple kindness undid something in Margaret. She didn't cry, but her throat tightened with a kind of relief she hadn't known she needed. "Merci," she whispered. "Direen," Claire said, smiling. "That's what friends are for, Nan." The next few days passed slowly. Margaret slept often, drifting in and out of shallow dreams. She ate simple soups, read short paragraphs of her French novel without forcing comprehension, and let the sun warm her through the open windows. Neighbors sent small gifts, fresh bread, a jar of fig jam, a book of French idioms scribbled with notes from a retired teacher who lived down the street. Anne, from the watercolor class, dropped off lavender from her garden. One afternoon, she woke to the sound of knocking, not on her door, but on the window that faced the alley. Henry's drawing, the one she had pinned to the sill, had slipped, and a young boy from the building next door was tapping to let her know. He handed it back through the open shutters shyly. "Mercy," she said, and then, surprising herself, added, "Il s'appelle Henry. C'est mon petit-fils." The boy smiled. "Il dessine Bean." He waved and ran off. Margaret stared at the drawing for a long time, then smoothed it flat and placed it on the desk again. By the end of the week, the pain had mostly faded. Her body felt like hers again. Older, yes, but not fragile. Just ... real . She thought about how much effort it took to start over. How much courage it demanded to carry both grief and joy in the same suitcase. She wasn't invincible. She was not broken on Sunday. She returned to the harbor with her sketch pad. The light had shifted slightly since she'd last been there. The sea more turquoise now, shadows longer. Anne waved from the next stool over. The painter from the dinner party nodded hello. Even the man with the book in the jazz habit passed by and tipped his cap. Margaret opened her pad and let the watercolors bleed into the page. She didn't care what it looked like. It was the act of it, the sitting, the trying, the being here, that mattered. That night she opened her journal and wrote, "I had a bad week, but it didn't ruin me. People came. They saw me. They stayed. I think I might be building a life. Here. Not a perfect one, but a real one." She closed the book, stood by the window, and watched the sea. No calls from Thomas, no new letters. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was waiting for one. She had shown up for herself, and in the quiet of her flat, with lavender on the sill and a half-done painting on her table, that was enough. It began with a poster taped to the boulangerie window. Just below the usual notices for piano lessons and lost cats was a bold, sun-faded sheet that read, "Fête des Lumières, Samedi Sawyer. Place du Marche, 20 hours, the Festival of Light." Margaret stared at it while waiting for her change, mouthing the words quietly to herself. Back home, she asked Claire about it. "It's a local tradition," Claire explained over tea. "Nothing religious, really. More symbolic. We light candles, paper lanterns, float them by the water. It's about renewal. Letting go of what no longer serves us." "Sounds poetic," Margaret said. "It's also an excuse to drink too much rose and dance badly," Claire added with a grin. Margaret laughed. She hadn't danced in years. Not since Thomas's wedding, and even then she'd felt like a borrowed piece of decoration. Something polite, but unnecessary. But this felt different. She wrote it down in her calendar. Samedi. Arsha Sausher. Marsh in pen. That Saturday she dressed with more care than usual. A soft navy blouse she'd almost left behind in Oregon. Comfortable sandals. A touch of lipstick. She stood by the mirror for a moment, unsure what she was hoping to see. Not youth. Not exactly, but maybe proof that she still knew how to shine. Even gently, Claire met her in the square. The light was low and golden, the sky shifting from coral to deep lavender. Families gathered around long folding tables, strings of fairy lights swaying above them. Children ran barefoot across the cobblestones. their laughter loud and easy. Margaret watched the townspeople place lanterns along the fountain. Some were made of paper, others of glass jars painted by hand. Each flickered with a warm, flickering flame. "Here," Claire said, handing her a small lantern with a blue ribbon tied around it. "You're part of this now. You get a flame, too." Margaret took it carefully, her fingers steady. The mayor, a short, round woman with booming charisma, gave a speech Margaret only half understood. But it didn't matter. The meaning was clear enough. Light what matters, let go of what doesn't. Then the music began. It started with a slow, lilting tune, a folk song Margaret didn't recognize, and then gradually shifted to something livelier. People clapped. Someone pulled Claire into the crowd, and a moment later Margaret found herself swaying beside them. She didn't know the steps, but no one seemed to care. The air was full of roasted garlic and grilled fish, the smell of lavender and wine. Someone handed her a glass. She tasted it without asking what it was. Light and fruity. She felt warmth rise in her chest, not from the alcohol, from something else. Presence for so long she had measured herself by absence of family, of usefulness, of home. But here, in this sun-drenched square, with strangers who now knew her name and the sound of her laugh, she felt whole, not young, not old, just Margaret. Later that night, after the lanterns had been floated down the little canal and the music had softened, she sat on a bench with Claire and Anne, sharing a paper plate of almond tart. "I understood most of the speech," Margaret said, surprised. "Not every word, but enough. See?" Anne said, raising her cup. "The old lady's got ears now." They all laughed. Claire looked at her warmly. "Your French is growing." "And so are you." Margaret smiled, tilting her head toward the flickering line of lanterns drifting into the distance. "I think I'm starting to like who I'm becoming." Claire leaned in gently. "We already do." Back in her studio, barefoot and still humming the folk tune, Margaret lit a small candle by her window. She didn't need a ceremony. Just a moment. She picked up her journal and wrote, "Tonight I danced. I laughed. I didn't check my phone once. I didn't wonder if I should be somewhere else. It was exactly where I wanted to be. I don't know if Thomas will ever understand that, but I think I'm beginning to. Some things don't need fixing. They just need light. I am no longer waiting to be invited back into a life I outgrew." She blew out the candle and let the dark come slowly. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like loneliness, it felt like peace. The envelope was heavier than it needed to be. Margaret found it wedged awkwardly in her mailbox, folded slightly at the edges. There was no return address. Just her name, written in familiar blocky handwriting, and the international stamp smeared slightly with rain. She didn't need to read the name to know who had written it. Thomas. She stood at the foot of the staircase for a full 5 minutes, letter in hand. The sun filtered through the alley, catching on the crumpled corners, casting shadows on the cobblestones. When she finally went upstairs, she didn't open it right away. She made tea first. Let the kettle whistle. Let the steam fog up the window. Let her heart settle. Then she sat, slowly tore the flap open, and began to read. "Mom, I don't know how to start this, so I'll just say I'm sorry. I've replayed that day at the door more times than I can admit. I was angry, overwhelmed, and I took it out on you. I've always done that, pushed you away when I didn't want to feel guilty. You gave me everything. I made you feel like you were in the way. I guess I didn't understand how heavy life can feel until I was the one holding the pieces. Work is a mess. Henry is wild. Angela, well, we're trying. She told me she wrote to you. I haven't asked what she said. Maybe I'm afraid it was kinder than anything I've managed to say out loud. I saw your postcard on the fridge this morning, the one from that village, Collier. Henry asks to look at it sometimes. Says you live in a painting now. I hope you're happy. I don't know if I deserve to be part of that. But if you ever want to call, we'd answer. Love. Thomas. Margaret finished reading, then laid the letter on the table beside her. She didn't move for a long time. There it was, an opening, a thread. But something in her hesitated. Later that day, she met Claire for their regular walk. Town shimmered under the early summer light. Every color sharper than usual, the blue of the sea, the orange-tiled roofs, the green climbing vines that curled over the stone walls. "You're quiet," Claire said gently. "I got a letter," Margaret replied, "from my son." Claire nodded, not asking questions she knew Margaret wasn't ready to answer. "Do you want to go back?" she asked softly. Margaret thought for a long moment. "I don't know. That's the thing. I thought I wanted the apology, the contact. But now that it's here, I'm not sure I want to open that door again. At least, not in the same way." "Maybe it doesn't have to be the same way," Claire said. They walked in silence for a while, the breeze fluttering through the olive trees. That night, Margaret sat by the open window with a notebook on her lap. Not her journal, just plain paper, clean and unfamiliar. She began writing a letter she might never send. "Thomas, thank you for your words. They meant more than I expected and less than I needed. Okay? And that's not your fault. I've changed. I live in a small town where people know my name, where I'm learning how to speak in another tongue, and also in my own, where I matter even when I'm not needed. I don't hate you. I don't even resent you. I think I just outgrew the life where I waited to be forgiven. Maybe we'll find a new way forward, one that isn't built on obligation, but on curiosity. Until then, I'll keep sending postcards. You don't have to reply. Just know I'm not lost. Love, Mom." She folded it, didn't seal it, tucked it between the pages of a French novel she hadn't finished yet. A few days later, she went to the post office and sent Henry another postcard, this time with a drawing of her favorite cafe. "Tell your dad I'm well," she wrote at the bottom. "And tell him I said thank you." Margaret didn't call, not yet, but she also didn't cry. She made lentils with thyme and roasted tomatoes. She painted for an hour. Then she took her sketchbook to the cafe, ordered a glass of white wine, and listened to the ocean breathe. And in her silence, there was no emptiness, only clarity. It was the third time she saw him, always at the same cafe, always at the same table, the one under the crooked awning where the sun broke through in sharp, deliberate slants. A paperback in hand, a glass of something pale and sparkling beside him. Margaret had noticed him before, of course, the white stubble, the long fingers that turned pages slowly, like he didn't want to rush whatever world he was holding, but today he looked up first. Their eyes met, not the way young people do, searching or daring, but with a simple recognition, like a nod between two travelers who've been walking the same road from opposite directions. She smiled. He returned it, and that might have been the end of it. But when she went inside to pay, he stood up, quietly. "Excuse me," he said, his French slow and careful. "I believe we've seen each other before." His accent wasn't local, neither was hers. "I think we have," she replied in French, then hesitated. "Are you not French?" he said, smiling. "I'm from Edinburgh, Oregon," she offered. He said as if it explained everything. "Well, that explains the good posture." She laughed. They introduced themselves. His name was James, a retired literature professor who'd come to Collier for a 6-month sabbatical that turned into 3 years widowed, 2 grown daughters, an apartment above the cheese shop. "I suppose I stayed," he said, "because no one expected me to." She understood that more deeply than she could say. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed more often. Not deliberately, not at first. They simply began to notice each other. A wave across the square, a shared nod in the language school courtyard. He was learning Catalan to impress a grocer who doesn't care. Sometimes they ended up at the same table at the cafe, sipping coffee in parallel. It was easy. Not flirtation, not yet. Just companionship in the quietest form. One morning after class, He asked if she'd like to join him at the bookstore near the harbor. They get secondhand English novels once a month. You have to fight the British tourists for them. I can hold my own, Margaret said. She didn't mean to say yes. But she did, and she was glad she did. The bookstore was a narrow, cluttered space that smelled like dust and jasmine. The owner, a woman with purple-rimmed glasses and a perpetually skeptical cat, greeted James by name. Margaret watched as he thumbed through a battered copy of Middlemarch, his fingers brushing the pages like they held secrets. You know, he said, when my wife passed, I tried to read my way through grief. Didn't work, just made the silence feel more articulate. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. I cleaned, she said. Reorganized every drawer, gave things away. Thought if I created enough order outside of myself, it would fix the mess inside, did it? No, she said. But I found a scarf I thought I'd lost. That felt like something. He smiled. They left the bookstore with 2 novels and 1 antique postcard, which he insisted on buying for her. You can send it to your future self, he said. Tell her something useful. That night she did, on the back of the postcard in neat handwriting. She wrote, You're allowed to feel safe with someone again. It doesn't mean you owe them anything. It just means your walls aren't the only things holding you up. She placed it in the same drawer where she kept the unsent letters. Not hidden, just waiting. A few days later, James invited her to a small poetry reading. Not your thing. He asked. I didn't say that, she said. You didn't have to. They walked there slowly, side by side, their arms never touching but somehow aligned. The reading was held in a quiet courtyard strung with lights. Locals read in French and Catalan, their voices soft against the rustling leaves. James leaned in once, during a poem about distance and rivers, and whispered, I understood none of that, but it made me feel something. Margaret smiled. Then, you understood exactly enough. That night, after the reading, he walked her to her building. They stood outside, the door half open behind her. This was nice, he said. It was. There was no pause, no tension, no expectation. Good night, Margaret. Good night, James. And that was all. No promises. No pressure, just the beginning of something gentle. Later, in her journal, she wrote, I didn't feel younger tonight. I didn't feel swept away, but I felt seen and safe and soft. It's strange to feel something new at this age. Not passion, not panic, just possibility. I think that might be better. She closed the journal, turned out the light, and let sleep come easily for once, with no ghosts at the edge of her bed, just her own breath steady in the dark. The invitation came folded in thirds, tucked into a pocket of her workbook. At the end of Tuesday's language class, Marianne had pulled Margaret aside. There's something you might be interested in, she said, handing her the paper. There, looking for a volunteer at the community center, someone to help local teens with English. A few hours a week, nothing formal. Margaret unfolded it slowly, scanned the brief description. Free conversation classes, casual tutoring, no experience required. You think I'm ready? She asked. Marianne smiled. I think you all ready. Do it every day, patiently, kindly, and without fear of mistakes. That's all teaching really is. Margaret didn't answer right away. The paper felt strangely heavy in her hand. Not like pressure, like possibility. She spent that night sitting by the window, the folded flyer beside her tea. She wasn't sure why it stirred her so much. Maybe because she hadn't felt needed in a long time, not for something she could give, rather than something she could fix. She thought of Henry, of the bedtime stories, the gentle corrections. The way he'd once asked her if the moon followed Grandma home too. She thought of how many times she had longed to matter again, and how, slowly, she was learning that you didn't have to be central to someone else's world to feel worthy in your own. She said yes. The next morning, the community center was small, sunlit, and full of chatter. The teens were a mixed group, French, Moroccan, Spanish, and looked at her with a mix of amusement and skepticism. When she first walked in, she was older than their other volunteers, but she smiled, steady and open. "I'm Margaret," she said in English, "and I make a lot of mistakes in French. So you're allowed to do the same in English." They laughed, not unkindly, and one boy in the back raised his hand. "You know rap?" he asked. "Only a little," she said, "but I know how to conjugate irregular verbs." We all have our talents. By the end of the first hour, 2 of them had asked for help with job interview phrases. One girl shyly asked how to write a song lyric in English, and someone had drawn a tiny cartoon of her on the whiteboard. "La, Professor Cool," it said beneath. She walked home that afternoon lighter than she had in weeks. James stopped by the cafe where she sat correcting a worksheet. "So now you're corrupting the youth?" he asked, grinning. "Teaching them to ask for water without accidentally ordering wine," she replied. "I'm a public service." He sat across from her, ordered nothing, looked at her, calm and quiet. "You're glowing," he said. She rolled her eyes but didn't disagree. "I'd forgotten what it felt like," she said, "to be good at something, to give something. You've always been good at things. You just didn't always get told." There was a silence between them then, not awkward, not charged, just full. He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly, his fingers warm. "I like seeing you like this," he said. That weekend, Claire organized a small dinner at her flat. A few neighbors, a bottle of wine too old to still be good, and laughter that bounced off the tile floor. Margaret brought lemon tarts. James brought a book of Catalan tongue twisters and made everyone try to recite them with a straight face. Margaret caught herself watching him across the table. The way he leaned in when people spoke, the way he waited before responding, the way he made others feel heard. He caught her watching, smiled. She didn't look away. Later that night, walking home under a crisp sky, he asked if he could see her again outside their usual cafes and circles. "Not serious," he said quickly, "just intentionally." She stopped walking, looked at him. "You already see me?" she said softly. "Then I'd like to keep doing that." She nodded. And they kept walking. No hand-holding, no declarations. Just a yes, quietly placed between them. The next week, her students surprised her with a card, folded construction paper, slightly smudged. Inside, it read, "Thank you for making mistakes with us. You are brave and funny. We want to be like you when we are not teenagers anymore. Also, you are better at French than you think." She blinked hard, took a deep breath, then pinned it beside Henry's drawing on her wall. That night, she wrote in her journal, "I didn't come here to teach, came here to remember. But maybe they're the same thing." James asked to see me, like I was something worth noticing. The students thanked me like I was someone worth learning from, and today I didn't question whether I deserved any of it. I just said thank you. She closed the journal not out of habit but with care, like closing the cover of a book she was proud to be part of. She saw them before they saw her, standing just outside the flower shop, a bouquet of soft pink peonies in her hand. Margaret turned and caught sight of them across the square. Angela, her posture precise as ever, and Henry, now tall enough to carry his own backpack, bouncing beside her like a question, waiting to be asked. Margaret's chest tightened. It had been nearly a year. She had imagined this moment a dozen different ways. Dramatic reunions, tearful hugs, angry words softened by apology. But in the end, it arrived quietly, without fanfare, without warning. Just 2 familiar figures in an unfamiliar place. Angela noticed her first. She offered a tentative smile, her eyes cautious but not cold. Henry spotted her next, his face lighting up, a small instinctive grin stretching across his cheeks. "Grandma." He didn't wait, just ran. Margaret knelt, arms open. He flew into her chest like a bird returning after a long migration. She held him tightly, her eyes stinging. "You got taller," she whispered, voice caught somewhere between joy and disbelief. "You got more French," he said, pulling back with a grin. She laughed a sudden, real sound. "Come," she said, glancing at Angela. "Let's sit." Walked to the cafe. It's the same one where she'd met James for the first time. It's the same chairs, the same faint hum of waves beyond the square. Angela ordered a citron press. Margaret ordered tea. Henry ordered hot chocolate with extra cream and immediately began drawing something on a napkin. The silence between the women was fragile. Not tense, but careful. "I'm sorry we didn't write first," Angela began. "I'm glad you didn't," Margaret said gently. "If I'd had time to prepare, I would have found a way to ruin it." Angela smiled faintly. "You look well?" "I am. For the first time in a long time." There was a pause. Margaret sipped her tea. "Thomas didn't come," Angela said. Margaret nodded. "I didn't expect him to. He's still learning how to let go of being right. Aren't we all?" Angela looked down at her drink. "I wasn't always fair to you," she said softly. "I thought your presence made him weaker, that you reminded him he didn't have it all together. And I didn't want our son to see that." Margaret didn't respond right away. The words were too heavy to rush. "I was too attached to being needed," she said. "I thought being useful meant being loved." They sat with that for a moment. Then Henry held up his napkin. "Look," he said, "it's you and me. On a boat." Margaret smiled. "Do we have life jackets?" "Nope, just croissants." They spent the afternoon walking along the harbor. Margaret showed them the street where her language class met. It's the community center where she tutored. The bench where she sketched after dinner. Henry peppered her with questions. "Is your French good now? Do you have a cat? You miss Oregon? Are you going to stay here forever?" She answered each one honestly. "Better than it was. No cat, but I know a neighbor's. I miss pieces of it. I don't know yet." Angela watched her closely, quietly taking in a version of Margaret she had never seen before. Softer in some ways, firmer in others. A woman not diminished by distance, but expanded by it. At sunset, they stood by the water. Angela hesitated, then spoke. "He'll come around, Thomas. I don't know when, but seeing you here, I think it'll matter." Margaret didn't answer. Right away, she reached down and took Henry's hand. "I'm not waiting," she said, "but my door's open." "That's the best I can offer." Angela nodded. They stood there, three silhouettes in the gold and lavender light, watching the sea swallow the day. Back at her flat, Henry hugged her so tightly she felt it in her ribs. "Don't stop sending postcards," he said. "'Kay, only if you don't stop reading them." Angela lingered for a moment at the door. "Thank you," she said, "for being better than I was." "We were all doing our best," Margaret said softly. "Maybe now we're doing better." Angela nodded once. Then they were gone. Margaret sat by the window that night, the scent of peonies in the air, the sea calm. She didn't cry, she just wrote, "He didn't come," but she did, and so did he. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a fix. But it was enough. I don't need everything back, just the parts that still know how to grow. She closed the journal and went to bed, not full of hope, but full of truth. And sometimes that was even better. They left early, before the sun had fully stretched across the rooftops. James had mentioned the idea weeks ago. A day trip to Perpignan, little over an hour away by train. Called it a city that doesn't try to impress you, which made Margaret like it instantly. "There's a bookstore I think you'll love," he'd said, "and an old cloister. Also a really terrible but charming restaurant that serves anchovies in 7 forms. I make no promises." She had hesitated. Then, not because she didn't want to go, but because she knew what it would mean to say yes to go somewhere with him. To be seen together, step outside the daily rhythm of Collier and still choose each other. But now, on a crisp morning with the sea winking behind them, she sat beside him on the slow-moving train, knees brushing gently, and felt only stillness. Inside, Perpignan was modest and sun-washed. Narrow alleys and faded facades, the Catalan flags hanging from balconies like forgotten kites. The bookstore, a quiet little cave of secondhand paperbacks and mismatched shelves, did not disappoint. James found a battered edition of Steinbeck in French, raised an eyebrow, and bought it purely for the irony. Margaret wandered without urgency. She ran her fingers along the spines, flipped through cookbooks in languages she didn't understand. She found a slim volume of poems by Jacques Prévert, its pages worn, a name scribbled in the inside cover. Marcel, 1972. She bought it without knowing why. They ate lunch at a tiny cafe with bad lighting and excellent lentils. James teased. The waiter in a French so dry it almost evaporated. Margaret tried anchovies again and still didn't like them. But she didn't care. This isn't a big trip, she said, stirring her coffee. Not Paris. Not something people plan for. Years. No, James said, but you packed a toothbrush. That feels significant. I didn't bring a spare outfit. Then I'll consider this a risk worth taking. She laughed. They wandered through the cloister that afternoon. Romanesque arches and sunlit stone. Margaret trailed her fingers. Along the wall, the stone cool and forgiving. She thought of all the hands that had passed here. All the footsteps, silent choices, forgotten names. On the train ride home, James fell asleep with his shoulder leaning slightly into hers. She didn't move. Outside, the vineyards blurred past, green fading into dusk. For a moment she closed her eyes and let herself imagine this as ordinary. A life that wasn't suspended or borrowed, but fully lived. Back in Collier, her flat was warm with the memory of them. James walked her to the door, as always. But he didn't linger with the awkwardness of someone hoping for more. He simply said, I had a good day. So did I. Next time we go somewhere truly dangerous. Like where? IKEA. On a weekend. She laughed and reached out, touching his hand just briefly on her own terms. Thank you, he nodded. You're welcome. He left, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside. That night, she opened her journal. The Prévert book lay beside her. And she read a line that struck her. Et puis il a for la porte-vic esse clef, dans la clef du bonheur. And then he closed the door with his key in the key of happiness. She thought about that, about doors and locks and keys that don't just shut things away, but open new ones. She wrote, today wasn't a beginning. It wasn't dramatic or faded or wild. But it felt like something solid beneath my feet. Like the ground stopped shifting. I brought a toothbrush. I wasn't afraid to come home. She placed the Prévert book on her shelf, beside the postcard to her future self and Henry's boat drawing. A little museum of becoming. Then she went. To bed, the window open, the sea breathing in and out, steady like her own. The morning was still, not quiet in the way of emptiness, but in the way of settling, like dust that finally knows where to land. The shutters were open. The sea outside moved softly, almost like it was breathing with her. On the table, a bowl of figs, a cooling cup of tea, and a postcard addressed this time to no one. She hadn't written it yet, but she would. It had been 14 months since she'd arrived in Collier with a suitcase full of grief and uncertainty. Then seasons had shifted. Friends had grown closer, and she had stopped thinking of this life as an interruption now. Simply was. Claire was moving to Lyon. It was sudden, but not dramatic. Her daughter was expecting a baby, and Claire wanted to be close. They'd cried a little, share day, bottle of wine and a pot of cassoulet the night before, and promised to write letters even though they both knew texts would come first. You'll miss me, Claire had said, grinning. Already do, Margaret had replied. Don't get boring without me. Impossible. There was sadness, yes, but no panic, no desperate fear of being alone. Margaret had learned to trust her own company and the quiet network she'd built here, person by person. The language school had asked her to take over a weekly English class, not as a volunteer this time, but as part of the team. You're not a teacher, Marianne said, but you are exactly what these people need. Margaret had said yes without blinking. On Thursday mornings, she stood at the front of a small room, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, and guided students through real conversation, not tests, not drills. Just stories, jokes, mistakes, always welcome. And every week, someone would linger afterward to thank her, to practice a sentence to say that they now believed it was okay. To start late. James had stayed. He still teased her, still showed up at her door with lopsided pastries and opinions about obscure novels. Sometimes they spent hours apart, days even, lost in their own projects. But they always came back to each other, not in the way of possession, in the way of recognition. "You make space feel like home," he said once, during an ordinary lunch with crumbs between them. "So do you," she replied. That was all. It was enough in early spring. Margaret received a package from Oregon. Inside was a framed photo. Henry. In a blue sweater she remembered buying years ago, holding up a sign he'd clearly made himself. "Bonjour, Grandma. G time." A single line in Angela's handwriting. He asked if he could visit next summer. "We'd like to bring him, if that's okay." Margaret placed the frame on her windowsill. She didn't cry, but she sat with the photo for a long time. Not as a relic, but as a seed. Something that might grow again, slowly, not to what it once was, but into something true. That evening, she returned to her desk and picked up the blank postcard. She wrote slowly, carefully, "Dear you, you didn't disappear. You didn't crumble. You changed. You softened. You stepped outside the story others wrote for you and started scribbling your own lines in the margins. It's not perfect, it's not simple, but it's yours now. You live near the sea and you've learned how to float. You are not waiting anymore. You're living. Love." Margaret Shee placed the card in her journal next to the drawing of the boat, the notes from her students, and the first page she'd written when she arrived. Then she stepped outside barefoot. Onto the small balcony where the lanterns still swayed from last summer. The night was warm. The town was breathing. And she finally fully was part of it.